A new category of edible material entered production in the mid-20th century. It integrated seamlessly into kitchens and institutions as a matter of convenience. Its physiological effects would not become apparent for decades. This was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a quiet redesign. The shift began in institutional settings, hospitals, schools, military bases, places where efficiency mattered more than tradition, where feeding large numbers of people quickly became an engineering problem, not a culinary one. The solution arrived in aluminum trays, plastic pouches, and cardboard boxes, pre-portioned, shelf-stable, designed to survive transport, storage, and reheating without anyone needing to know how to actually cook. At the time, this was presented as progress, a way to feed more people with fewer hands, to standardize nutrition across regions, across income levels, across seasons. The language used was clinical, scientific, rational. No one talked about what was being lost because the focus was entirely on what was being gained: consistency, convenience, cost reduction. By the late 1960s, this model had moved beyond institutions. Supermarkets began stocking aisles with products that didn't spoil, didn't require preparation, didn't demand any knowledge of ingredients or techniques. Dinner could come from a box, breakfast from a pouch, snacks from a vending machine. And because it was new, because it was marketed as modern, because it appeared in every store and every commercial, it blended into everyday life without resistance. Most people didn't question it. There was no reason to. The food looked like food. It was approved by experts. It appeared on the same shelves as everything else, and it solved a real problem for families where both parents were working, where time was scarce, where cooking from scratch felt like a luxury from another era. This wasn't discussed openly, not in the way policy changes or economic shifts were debated. It happened quietly, in grocery carts and school cafeterias and hospital meal trays. A slow replacement of one system with another, carried out not through force, but through sheer availability. By the time someone might have thought to ask what was different, the old way had already started to disappear. Children growing up in the 1970s and 80s didn't experience this as a transition. For them, it was simply what food was. Brightly colored packages, cartoon mascots, foods engineered to taste the same whether purchased in Maine or California, in January or July. There was no before to compare it to, no reference point for what meals used to be. And because it became normal so quickly, because it was never framed as experimental, most people never noticed this at the time. The real impact appeared years later, not as immediate illness or visible harm, but as a slow drift in patterns, in how bodies responded to food, in how hunger and satisfaction were experienced, in the baseline expectations children developed about what eating was supposed to feel like. By the 1990s, researchers began documenting changes that didn't fit previous models: shifts in metabolism, alterations in gut bacteria populations, changes in how the brain signaled fullness. None of this was sudden, none of it could be traced to a single product or ingredient, but the patterns were consistent across populations that had grown up eating this new category of food. The design itself discouraged awareness. These products were engineered to override natural satiation signals, to be consumed past the point of nutritional need, to trigger cravings that felt like hunger but operated on a different mechanism entirely. Not through any single addictive substance, but through precise combinations of fat, sugar, salt, and texture that human taste receptors had no evolutionary framework to regulate. And because this engineering was proprietary, because formulas were protected as trade secrets, because the regulatory system treated these items as food rather than designed consumables, there was no public record of what was being optimized or why. By the time consequences were visible, habits were already set. Not just individual habits, but cultural ones. Entire generations had been raised with these products as the baseline. The knowledge of how to prepare food from raw ingredients, how to recognize seasonality, how to adjust recipes, how to cook without instructions had been interrupted in transmission. Not erased, but no longer passed down as a necessary skill. This wasn't about individual choice. A parent in 1975 walking into a supermarket wasn't choosing between real food and fake food. They were choosing between what was available, affordable, and possible given the time and resources they had. The system had already made the structural decisions. The individual was just navigating what remained. The schools served it. The hospitals served it. The government programs distributed it. Every signal from every institution said this was acceptable, normal, fine. To resist it required not just personal effort, but active opposition to the entire infrastructure of how food moved through society. And that infrastructure had been designed with a specific goal: to maximize production efficiency and shelf stability, not to optimize for human health over decades. The metrics that mattered were cost per serving, shelf life, ease of transport, resistance to spoilage. Whether it supported long-term metabolic function was never part of the engineering brief. The studies that did raise concerns were published in specialized journals, discussed in academic settings, debated among researchers who had no power to change the system they were documenting. The findings were technical, the language was careful, and the public conversation never shifted because there was no mechanism to translate research into policy, no incentive for the industry to redesign what was already profitable. By 2000, the majority of calories consumed in American households came from products that hadn't existed 50 years earlier. Not variations on traditional food, not new recipes, but entirely novel categories of edible material, assembled in factories, designed to specifications that prioritized everything except the evolutionary needs of human digestion. Children born in that era entered a world where this was the default, where cooking meant reheating, where ingredients meant whatever was listed on a package, where the taste of food was determined by flavor chemists, not by soil or season, or the skill of the person preparing it. The human body, which had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to process a narrow range of foods, was now being asked to adapt to substances it had no biological precedent for. Not poisons, not toxins, just configurations of nutrients and additives that digestive systems had never encountered in combination, at that concentration, with that frequency. And because the effects were gradual, because they accumulated over years, not days, because they varied by individual and couldn't be linked to any single meal or product, there was no clear moment of realization, no point where someone could say, "This is when it changed." The system didn't require conspiracy. It didn't require intent to harm. It only required optimization for the wrong variables: profit over time, shelf life over nutrition, convenience over consequence. And once that system was in place, once it employed millions of people, once it generated billions in revenue, once it became integrated into global supply chains and school lunch programs and food assistance policies, reversing it stopped being a matter of individual choice. It became a structural question that no single person, no single family, no single community could answer on their own. The experiment continued, not because anyone decided it should, but because stopping it would require dismantling the very infrastructure that modern food distribution depended on. Because the alternative, returning to a system where food was seasonal, perishable, requiring skill and time to prepare, was no longer compatible with how society had organized itself. People noticed something was wrong. That much was clear. but the explanations offered were always individual: willpower, discipline, personal responsibility. The idea that the food itself might be designed to override self-regulation, that the system itself might be structured to produce harm, remained outside mainstream conversation. Not because it was false, but because accepting it would require acknowledging that an entire century of food policy had been an uncontrolled experiment on the general population. That the experts who approved these changes, the companies that profited from them, the institutions that normalized them, had built something that worked beautifully for distribution and failed fundamentally at nourishment. And that realization, for most people, remained just out of reach. Sensed but not articulated, felt but not explained. Perhaps you remember the specific taste of something from childhood that doesn't exist anymore. Not discontinued, just different now in a way that's hard to name. That wasn't the only change. The same logic that transformed food moved into other areas, other systems, other aspects of daily life that were quietly re-engineered for efficiency rather than human need. Similar decisions followed, in medicine, in education, in how communities were designed, how work was structured, how children spent their time. Each shift made sense in isolation. Each one solved a specific problem, and each one, taken together, created a world increasingly optimized for everything except the people living in it. That pattern didn't stop there.